Congressional Reconstruction. Just a quick note, some people refer to this as radical Reconstruction. I tend to prefer the term Congressional Reconstruction because, once again, there's a lot of loaded elements to the term radical, and it's more about Congress leading Reconstruction at this point. This time period sometimes is defined as being like 1867 through 1870, but also it can be seen as 1867 through 1877, which is when typically historians have stated Reconstruction ends. So we saw in the last video that Congress is now overriding the president's vetoes, and they're really going to take control of the Reconstruction process. We're going to see that radicals are going to do this by passing the Military Reconstruction Act. Once again, this is over Andrew Johnson's veto. With the exception of Tennessee, who had already ratified basically the 14th Amendment and already been readmitted to the Union, we can see on this map that basically what this Military Reconstruction Act does is it divides the Confederate States into 5 military districts, and then each of these districts would be headed by a general. Now, commanders in these different regions would basically conduct voter registration campaigns specifically to enroll Black people so that they could vote in future elections. The eligible voters at that point would then elect delegates to a state convention, and these state conventions would write a new constitution that had to include universal manhood suffrage. And after that was ratified and the 14th Amendment was ratified, then a state would be eligible to be readmitted into the Union. We're also going to see that Congress is going to pass the TenYear Office Act. This basically prohibited the president from removing certain office holders without the Senate's consent. Remember how the Senate has to confirm office holders for like the cabinet and things like that when the president puts his people forward for these positions, but the president could generally fire them without the Senate's consent. Now they're saying no, the Senate has to give them permission, the president permission to remove these people from office. Andrew Johnson is not happy about this because it was clearly a way that Congress was trying to limit his power. And so he actually deliberately violated the TenYear Office Act by firing the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, who is a leading radical Republican at this time. At this point, the House of Representatives would respond by approving articles of impeachment against the United States president for the first time in American history. Andrew Johnson is impeached. Impeached means that articles of impeachment are brought against him. However, he is going to be acquitted. Basically, when the Senate does their trial to determine removal, the thing is, it's very clear that Andrew Johnson had violated the TenYear Office Act, but basically enough Republicans deserted their own party and Johnson ends up being acquitted. But you can say Andrew Johnson was impeached. He just was acquitted of charges and therefore he wasn't removed from office. However, as much as this means he wasn't removed from office, it does ease the way for, in the next presidential election, the Republican Party is not going to have Andrew Johnson as their candidate. Instead, they are going to put forward Ulysses S. Grant, who was obviously known from the Civil War, and he was considered a moderate Republican. This is coming up to the presidential election of 1868 specifically. So during that election, we're going to see Republicans are going to remind voters of Democratic disloyalty. They're going to remind voters of the sacrifices of war and that the peace that the Republican Party brought to America. Whereas the Democratic side, they're going to denounce Congressional Reconstruction and say that this is federal tyranny. And the Democrats are going to use openly racist appeals. They're going to warn white voters that, oh, if Republicans win the presidency, then that's going to mean black rule because, oh, we're giving black people the right to vote and everything, and so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Grant wins. However, it's really an uncomfortably narrow victory. This should have been like an overwhelming victory for Grant, and it wasn't necessarily that. And in fact, if you look at Grant's margin of victory, a lot of what can be accounted for that margin is black voters' support, especially in the South. Still, Republicans are going to retain a strong majority in both houses in Congress. And at this point, it is reaffirming that they are really trying on some level, to give African Americans civil rights and voting rights. And so they are going to pass the 15th Amendment in 1869. This would guarantee the right of American men to vote regardless of race. I should point out the 15th Amendment actually did anger a lot of like the women's suffrage movement. Many of them felt like they had been jilted because they felt like it didn't go far enough and that it should have given women the vote too. And then many of them also felt jilted because they felt like women should have gotten the vote before poor, uneducated African Americans. So you do see some racism in response within the suffrage movement, though not all of them were that way as well. So we're going to see basically Southern Republican governments during this time period instated in these former Confederate states. These former Confederate states are going to have to draft new state constitutions, and a lot of these constitutions are trying to embody a lot of the progressive principles that were new to the South. It's things like they would mandate the election of numerous local and state offices rather than having them be appointed. They would have a new commitment to public education. There would be a variety of reform movements, including things like social welfare, penal reform, legislative reapportionment, universal manhood suffrage. So who is exactly voting for Republicans in the South, though? You have really three groups that make up the constituency that are pro-Republican in the South. The first is going to be the scallywags. These were basically white Southern families. A lot of them were landowning farmers or well-off merchants or planters who supported the Southern Republican Party during Reconstruction. Then you have the carpetbaggers, who you actually can see here pictured, or a depiction of it, I should say. These were basically Northerners who supported the Republican Party in the South and had moved to the South after the war. But really the largest constituency of the Republican Party in the South during Reconstruction is African Americans. And in fact, 3 states, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, African Americans make up the majority of eligible voters. We are going to see that during this time period, for a time, the Republican Party did successfully mobilize black voters. But black voters were not just content to vote, they wanted to do more. In fact, they wanted to hold political office in their own right. We're going to see from 1869 through 1873, more members of the House of Representatives become black. We're going to see state legislatures are going to elect black representatives as well. And the thing is, black representatives in the House and at state legislatures, they didn't just promote race-specific legislation. A lot of times they supported things like debt relief or the state funding of education, which would have benefited all poor people, white and black. They also promoted measures like roads and sidewalks. The problem is, when we're looking at the Republican Party in the South, they really wanted to lure in moderate Democrats and unaffiliated white voters. but they also didn't want to slight the black vote within their party. And we're going to see the Republican Party is not going to be able to hold this really diverse constituency together by the time Reconstruction ends.